April 7, 1944. A teenage prisoner inside Auschwitz made a decision that almost certainly meant death. He wanted to escape, but not to just survive. He wanted to escape to deliver a warning. His name was Rudolf Vrba, a 19-year-old Slovak Jewish boy. For nearly 2 years, Vrba had lived inside the machinery of Nazi mass murder. He had witnessed thousands of people dying, not for crimes worthy of death, but for being Jews. By early 1944, something changed. Vrba learned that Hungary, one of the last large Jewish communities still intact in Europe, was now under direct German control. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were at risk of being sent to Auschwitz. Vrba believed that if those people knew the truth, that boarding the train to Auschwitz was not resettlement, but death, they would resist. He believed information could save lives. But information inside Auschwitz was trapped behind barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed guards. If a prisoner disappeared, the SS launched massive manhunts. Patrol dogs tracked escapees by scent. However, Vrba decided to carry out the escape plan. His mission? To expose Auschwitz and halt the mass murders. He studied everything. He observed guard routines. He memorized the layout of the camp. With another prisoner, Alfred Wetzler, Vrba began planning their escape. They prepared a hiding place inside a stack of wood near the camp's outer edge. They planned to vanish inside the camp for a few days before they can actually escape. It was a plan built on patience, timing, and nerve. As evening fell, Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler climbed into their hiding place and sealed themselves inside. Behind them lay one of the most lethal places on Earth. Ahead of them lay forests, borders, and a journey of more than 100 kilometers through occupied territory. And inside their heads, they carried something no Nazi officer could confiscate. A detailed account of how Auschwitz killed. They were not just fleeing. They were racing to speak before more trains arrived. If discovered in the woodpile, they would be shot immediately. If they ran too soon, dogs would find them. If they waited too long, they would starve to death. But if it worked, they would not only escape, they would become witnesses and stop the industry of Jewish extermination. This is the story of Rudolf Vrba, the teenager who escaped to expose Auschwitz horrors. Rudolf Vrba was born Walter Rosenberg in 1924, in what was then Czechoslovakia, in the town of Topolčany. He grew up in a Jewish family during a time when Europe was rapidly changing. By the late 1930s, Nazi Germany's influence was spreading, and anti-Semitic laws were tightening across Central Europe. Jewish families lost rights, jobs, and freedom of movement. Young Walter watched his world shrink. In 1942, at just 17 years old, he tried to flee to Britain through Hungary, hoping to join the Czechoslovak government in exile forces. Instead, he was arrested by Hungarian authorities and handed over to the Germans. He was deported to Auschwitz. He was still a teenager. Rudolf Vrba arrived at Auschwitz in June 1942 in a crowded cattle car after days of transport with little food, water, or air. He was still known as Walter Rosenberg, a 17-year-old Slovak Jew who had already seen his world collapse under Nazi rule. When the doors opened, shouting guards, barking dogs, and floodlights replaced the darkness. Within minutes, the system began stripping him of identity. But what Vrba would soon understand was that Auschwitz was not only a place of imprisonment, it was a process. And he was about to see how that process worked. His clothes were taken, his head was shaved, his name was replaced with a number, 44070. Vrba was assigned to a work detail known as Canada. This unit sorted the belongings of people who had just arrived at the camp: suitcases, clothes, food, personal items. Prisoners called it Canada because in their imagination, Canada represented wealth and abundance. Compared to other assignments, it sometimes offered slightly better chances of survival because food could occasionally be found among the confiscated goods. But the assignment came with a terrible clarity. Vrba quickly realized something chilling. The owners of these belongings were not coming back to claim them. Suitcases were labeled carefully with names and addresses. People had been told they would be resettled. Inside were everyday items, children's toys, family photographs, cooking pots, winter coats. The deception was deliberate. It kept people calm on arrival. From his position in Canada, Vrba began to connect the dots between arrival and disappearance. Vrba observed how trains arrived at Birkenau, the extermination section of Auschwitz. SS doctors and officers conducted what they called selections. In reality, these were instant life-or-death decisions made in seconds. Men and women who looked strong enough to work were sent into the camp. The elderly, the sick, pregnant women, and most mothers with small children were sent in another direction. They were told they were going to showers for disinfection. Vrba later testified that within a short time of working in Canada, he understood the truth. Those sent away were being killed in gas chambers. Smoke from crematoria chimneys, the smell in the air, and the constant flow of belongings into storage made the reality impossible to ignore. Auschwitz was not mainly a labor camp, it was a killing center disguised as one. Over months, Vrba began estimating numbers. He tracked the frequency of arriving transports. He noted how many people came in each train. He saw how quickly their possessions moved into storage. He also learned about the 4 large crematoria in Birkenau, each with attached gas chambers. Prisoners working near those areas shared information in whispers: how long gassings took, how many bodies were burned per day, how ashes were disposed of. Vrba had an analytical mind. Before the war, he had wanted to study science. Inside Auschwitz, that same attention to detail became a tool for survival, and later, for testimony. He was not only witnessing horror, he was gathering data. One of the most important things Vrba understood was how the Nazis used deception as a weapon. New arrivals were told they were being resettled for work. They were instructed to label luggage so it could be returned. They were told to remember the number of the peg where they hung their clothes before showering. The lie reduced panic. It prevented resistance. Vrba realized that this deception extended beyond the camp. Letters dictated under supervision were sent to families, creating the illusion that deported people were safe. The world outside was being kept in the dark, not only by distance, but by design. And that, to Vrba, became unbearable. At first, like most prisoners, Vrba focused on surviving day to day, finding food, avoiding punishment, enduring exhaustion. But over time, knowledge changed him. He later explained that once he understood the scale of the killing and the deception behind it, survival alone felt meaningless. If he lived but no one outside knew the truth, the system would continue untouched. But if someone escaped with credible, detailed information, numbers, layouts, procedures, it might break the illusion. It might warn Jewish communities still untouched. It might force Allied leaders to act. By 1943, this idea had hardened into resolve. Vrba no longer thought only about living through Auschwitz. He thought about getting out with the truth. In early 1944, news filtered into the camp that Germany had occupied Hungary. Hungary still had a large Jewish population that had not yet been deported to death camps. Vrba and other prisoners understood what that meant. Auschwitz was about to receive an enormous new wave of victims. He later estimated, correctly, that hundreds of thousands could be killed in a matter of months. Time was running out. Escape was no longer just an act of desperation. For Vrba, it became a mission. He would not escape blindly. He would escape as a witness. And everything he had learned in Canada, on the ramp, and through whispered exchanges across the camp would form the core of the report he hoped to deliver. Inside Auschwitz, Rudolf Vrba had been reduced to a number, but in his mind, he was building something the Nazis had not planned for, a record. And soon he would risk his life to carry it beyond the fences. By 1943, Rudolf Vrba was no longer just trying to survive Auschwitz. He was studying it, and he was not alone. Among the thousands of prisoners in Birkenau was Alfred Wetzler, a Slovak Jew who had been imprisoned since 1942. Like Vrba, Wetzler had witnessed the machinery of extermination up close. He understood the selections, the crematoria, and the deception used on new arrivals. Both men had reached the same conclusion. If the world learned exactly how Auschwitz worked, it might still be possible to save lives, especially the Jews of Hungary, whose deportation seemed imminent. But wanting to escape and surviving an escape were two very different things. They would need more than courage. They would need a plan based on observation, timing, and the smallest weaknesses in a system built to prevent escape. Auschwitz-Birkenau was surrounded by multiple layers of defense. Electrified barbed wire fences, guard towers with machine guns, SS patrols, dogs trained to track human scent. A restricted zone beyond the fences where civilians were forbidden to enter. If a prisoner went missing, sirens would sound and appel, roll call, would be repeated until every inmate was accounted for. Search teams would fan out into surrounding forests and fields. Most escape attempts ended within hours. Vrba and Wetzler understood they could not simply run. They needed to vanish first. Prisoners shared information quietly, passing knowledge like contraband. From earlier escape attempts, Vrba and Wetzler learned key patterns. Search operations were most intense in the first 48 to 72 hours after an escape was discovered. Guards believed that if escapees survived beyond that window, they were likely already far away or dead in the wilderness. They also learned that tracking dogs were one of the greatest threats. Dogs could follow scent trails for long distances, even at night. But there was a rumor, supported by some prisoner experience, that strong chemical smells could confuse the dogs. This detail became central to their plan. Rather than sprinting toward the fence immediately, Vrba and Wetzler decided on a counterintuitive strategy. They would hide inside the camp perimeter during the search. Near the edge of Birkenau, there were stacks of timber used for construction and repairs. With the quiet help of fellow prisoners, they prepared a narrow cavity inside one of these woodpiles, just large enough for 2 men to lie flat. They gathered tobacco, mixed with gasoline, and sprinkled it around the hiding place. The belief was that the strong odor might interfere with the dog's ability to pick up their scent. This was not guaranteed to work. Nothing about the plan was, but it gave them a chance. Timing was everything. They needed darkness, reduced guard visibility, and a moment when their absence might not be immediately obvious. They chose April 7th, 1944, a Friday. In the late afternoon, when prisoners were returning from work details and the camp was in motion, Vrba and Wetzler slipped away and crawled into the woodpile. They sealed the entrance with boards and debris from inside. Within hours, evening roll call revealed 2 prisoners missing. The alarm began. As searchlights swept the camp and guards shouted orders, Vrba and Wetzler lay motionless in darkness, so tight they could barely shift their weight. They could hear boots passing nearby. Voices, dogs. They lay there for 3 days. The smell of gasoline and tobacco filled the cramped space. Air was limited, muscles cramped. Outside, the SS conducted repeated searches. Patrols circled the perimeter. Dogs were brought through the area. At any moment, a guard could have prodded the woodpile or dismantled it. But they were not found. Camp procedure worked in their favor. After roughly 72 hours, if escapees were not found, search intensity often decreased. Guards assumed fugitives were either dead in the surrounding forests or too far to recover. Vrba and Wetzler knew this pattern. On Sunday morning, April 9th, a fellow prisoner urinated against the pile and whistled to signal that all was well. At 9 p.m. on 10th April, they crawled out of the woodpile. They were still inside the perimeter zone, still deep in occupied Poland. The most dangerous part of the escape was only beginning. But they had survived the phase that stopped most attempts. They had beaten the immediate response. And now, for the first time in years, they were outside the fence. Using a map they'd taken from Canada, torn from a children's atlas, the 2 men headed south towards Slovakia, 130 kilometers, 81 miles away, walking parallel to the Soa River. What made this escape different was not only how carefully it had been planned, it was why. Vrba and Wetzler had not risked their lives simply to disappear into anonymity. They carried with them a mental blueprint of Auschwitz, the layout of Birkenau, the locations of gas chambers, crematoria capacity, transport procedures, and estimates of the dead. They had memorized everything because they knew they might not survive the journey. And if one of them died, the other would still be able to testify. As they moved toward the dark tree line beyond the camp, they were no longer just prisoners on the run. They were witnesses trying to outrun a killing machine. On the night of April 10th, 1944, Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler crawled out of their hiding place at the edge of Birkenau. Behind them, the camp still operated. Searchlights swept the fences, trains continued to arrive. Ahead of them stretched open countryside, forests, rivers, villages, and hundreds of kilometers of German-occupied territory. They had no official papers, no maps, almost no food. And if they were caught, they would be executed on the spot. Vrba and Wetzler moved under cover of darkness, heading generally south towards Slovakia, their homeland. During the day, they hid in forests, ditches, or abandoned structures, barely daring to move. Traveling at night reduced the risk of being spotted by patrols or civilians who might report them, but it also meant navigating uneven ground in darkness, often without clear landmarks. They followed railway lines and rivers when they could, natural guides that pointed toward borders and towns they recognized from memory. Hunger quickly became a constant companion. They had taken only small scraps of food from the camp. Water came from streams and puddles. Sleep came in short, tense bursts. Every snapped twig sounded like pursuit. The countryside was not empty. German military units, local police, and collaborators operated across the region. Posters warned civilians to report escapees. Helping prisoners could mean imprisonment or death. Vrba later described the mental strain as overwhelming. Not only were they exhausted and starving, they had to decide constantly whether to avoid people or risk approaching someone for help. A single wrong choice could end everything. Despite the danger, they did receive help. In some villages, sympathetic locals quietly gave them food or directions. Others turned them away in fear. These encounters were brief and cautious. Trust had to be established in seconds. Often, they relied on language, speaking Slovak to signal who they were and where they were from. Each act of kindness carried enormous risk for those offering it. Without that help, the journey might have ended in the woods. Their path forced them to cross rivers swollen with spring runoff. Bridges were dangerous, often guarded or near settlements, so they sometimes waded through cold water, soaking their already thin clothing. They avoided major roads where identity checks were common. Instead, they cut across fields and forests, guided by memory, instinct, and the distant outline of the Carpathian Mountains, which marked the direction of Slovakia. Blisters covered their feet. Hunger weakened them. But turning back was impossible. Behind them was Auschwitz. Ahead of them was a chance to speak. After roughly 10 to 11 days on the run, they neared the Slovak border. This was still Nazi-controlled territory, but it brought them closer to underground resistance networks and people more likely to understand who they were. Crossing the border did not mean safety, but it meant possibility. Weak, dirty, and barely recognizable as the young men who had hidden in a woodpile days earlier, Vrba and Wetzler finally reached Slovak territory around April 21, 1944. They were free from Auschwitz, but the mission they had risked their lives for was only beginning. When Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler reached Slovakia in April 1944, they were physically free, but their mission had only begun. They needed to turn memory into testimony. And they needed to do it fast. Deportations from Hungary had already started. After crossing into Slovakia, the two men made contact with members of the Slovak Jewish Council in Žilina, an underground-linked organization trying to assist Jews under increasingly desperate conditions. At first, their appearance told the story: emaciated, exhausted, wearing worn camp clothing. But it was their knowledge that stunned those who listened. They described the selection ramp. They described gas chambers disguised as showers. They described crematoria burning bodies day and night. They described transports arriving from across Europe, and how few people were ever registered as prisoners. The scale was difficult to comprehend, so they began to dictate everything in detail. Over several days in late April 1944, Vrba and Wetzler gave a structured, systematic account of Auschwitz. The testimony was written down with the help of Oskar Krasnianski, a Slovak Jewish activist who translated their words into German. The document was later edited and expanded, becoming what is now known as the Vrba-Wetzler Report. It included a description of the layout of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the function of the gas chambers and crematoria, estimates of how many people were killed, the process of deception used on new arrivals, details about transports, including numbers and origins. The report estimated that around 1.5 to 1.75 million Jews had already been murdered at Auschwitz, an overestimate by modern historical standards, but a powerful indication of the scale of killing as perceived by eyewitnesses at the time. Most importantly, it explained that Auschwitz was not primarily a labor camp. It was an extermination center. At the moment the report was written, events were moving rapidly. Germany had occupied Hungary in March 1944. By May 1944, mass deportations of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz began. Trains arrived daily. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands were sent to their deaths. Vrba and Wetzler believed that if Jewish leaders, neutral governments, or allied powers knew the truth quickly enough, they might pressure Hungary's leadership to halt the deportations or warn communities in advance. The report was not just testimony, it was an alarm. Copies of the report were secretly distributed through resistance and diplomatic channels. It reached Jewish organizations in Switzerland. From there, information was passed to Western diplomats, the press, and the Vatican. By June 1944, details from the report began appearing in Swiss newspapers and were relayed to the BBC and other Allied information networks. For the first time, the world was receiving a detailed, structured eyewitness account explaining exactly how Auschwitz functioned as a killing center. Not rumor, not fragments, but a system described from the inside. As the information spread, pressure grew on Hungary's regent, Miklós Horthy. Diplomatic messages, public statements, and warnings from neutral countries and the Allies urged an end to deportations. Jewish leaders inside Hungary also began receiving clearer information about what resettlement really meant. On July 7, 1944, Horthy ordered a halt to the deportations from Budapest. By that point, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews from the provinces had already been sent to Auschwitz in just a few months. But the Jews of Budapest, tens of thousands of people, were temporarily spared mass deportation to the gas chambers. Historians continue to debate exactly how much influence the Vrba-Wetzler report had on these decisions. Many factors were involved, including military developments and diplomatic pressure. But there is broad agreement that the report played a significant role in shattering disbelief and providing concrete evidence that mass extermination was underway. After delivering their report, Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler did not step into peace. The war was still raging, Europe was still burning, but they had done what they set out to do. They had broken Auschwitz's silence. Vrba remained in Slovakia for a time, involved with resistance activity. As the front lines shifted and Nazi control weakened, the war that had shaped his youth finally began to end. He was only 21 years old. After the war, Vrba resumed the path that had been stolen from him as a teenager. He studied chemistry and biochemistry, eventually earning a doctorate. Over the decades, he worked as a scientist in several countries, including Czechoslovakia, Israel, the United Kingdom, and Canada. He became a respected researcher and later a professor of pharmacology at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. In laboratories and lecture halls, his life looked very different from the one he had known behind barbed wire. But Auschwitz never left him. Vrba believed that survival alone was not enough. He felt a lifelong responsibility to testify, not only about suffering, but about how the system functioned and how the world responded. In 1963, he published his memoir, I Escaped from Auschwitz, written with journalist Alan Bestick. The book offered one of the earliest and most detailed first-hand accounts of the camp's extermination process and the escape that led to the Vrba-Wetzler report. He gave interviews, he spoke at universities, he testified in legal proceedings related to Holocaust history and denial. Vrba often said that Auschwitz succeeded not only through brutality, but through deception and disbelief. Victims were misled. Outsiders struggled to grasp the scale. Warnings were delayed, doubted, or ignored. His escape had been an attempt to break that chain, to replace rumor with evidence. He knew that even the most detailed report could not bring back those who had already been murdered. But he believed it might save someone else. That belief had driven a 19-year-old to crawl into a woodpile and wait in darkness for 3 days, surrounded by guards who would have killed him instantly if discovered. Today, historians consider the Vrba-Wetzler report one of the most important early eyewitness documents about Auschwitz. It helped shift Auschwitz from whispered horror to documented reality. Rudolf Vrba died in 2006 at the age of 81. By then, Auschwitz was no longer a secret. Its ruins stand preserved, its history is studied across the world, its victims are remembered by name, and part of the reason we understand how it operated, in detail, not abstraction, is because one teenager decided that survival was not enough. Rudolf Vrba escaped a place designed to erase people without a trace. He carried no photographs, no stolen files, no physical proof. He carried memory, and he believed memory could fight lies. His journey reminds us that even in systems built on silence, truth can still find a way out. Carried by those willing to risk everything to speak.